With the impending release of the Classic WoW demo, I thought it'd be fun to compare our frame rates in Vanilla WoW to Classic WoW's demo. Keep in mind the demo is super incomplete, and I am running the Vanilla client and the WoW Classic demo client on my local computer. So let's take a look at this brief test and see how things shaped up. Test system specs are shown on screen along with software used to record frame times. The test location was set up on the southwest side of Westfall as shown on screen, and the camera was zoomed in all the way to the character as shown now. Keep in mind that there's a wider field of vision in the Classic demo than in the Vanilla gameplay, and there's not really an easy way to control for that, but it is what it is. Because there are no NPCs or game objects in the Classic demo, they were also disabled in the Vanilla test. All tests were conducted at 1440p resolution. For the Vanilla client, the only test conducted was at maximum settings. These are shown on screen with two notes. The refresh rate was actually set to 144 Hz, and the vertical sync was disabled. For the Classic client, two tests were conducted again at 1440p. One of these used the Classic settings button in the bottom left of the system menu. No other changes were made besides clicking the Classic button. And the final test was using the Classic client, setting all options to the maximum values available. All tests were conducted 3 times, and these results shown on screen are the average of these 3 tests. The green bar indicates the average frame rate, the red bar indicates the 1% lows, and the blue bar indicates the 0.1% lows. The 1% and 0.1% lows can kind of be considered your minimum frame rate in a sense, but more like the average of your lowest 1% of frames and the average of your lowest 0.1% of frames. Now the top 3 bars are the Vanilla gameplay bars at maximum settings, the middle ones are the Classic demo with the Classic option enabled, and the bottom set of bars are the Classic demo with maximum settings enabled. The first thing you should notice is that the green bars are all the same. They all average about 142 to 144 frames per second. There was actually no error between these. Basically the game stayed very steady at an average frame rate way up there. Now, this is actually a limitation of my hardware because I limit all frames to the maximum of my monitor's refresh rate, which is 144 frames per second. Very likely we could be pushing much higher frame rate on average across all 3 of these games if I unleashed the limiter. With that said, 144 frames per second, this is actually 142 frames per second is what I achieved, is great for all 3 games. All 3 games are very smooth. However, what you might notice is that the Vanilla gameplay at the top, the 1% lows especially, are significantly lower than either of the Classic gameplay options. We see a drop of almost 30% when playing in the Vanilla client to about 90 frames per second for the 1% lows versus around 130 frames per second for the 1% lows of the Classic client, whether it was at maximum settings or the Classic settings. What we're really looking at here is a demo of Classic, right? So this is a lot of things will change. We don't know exactly what spell effects will look like. We don't know what other changes to the engine may occur by the time the game launches. But right away, this is a very promising sign to me that the game is going to run better, in my opinion, than the Vanilla client ran. And this is on modern hardware. This is actually on very modern hardware. And my test system is probably beyond what the average person will be running. But I think on any modern set of hardware, anything in the last 5 years, you will probably find a better low frame time on the Classic client than on the Vanilla client. And what that means is that your game will feel a lot smoother. Your average frame rate will probably be very similar. You're going to max out your monitor's refresh rate probably in most cases, but you should see much higher dips. So what this really means is that you will very likely see much more stable frame rate across the board with the Classic client compared to what you remember on the Vanilla client. And that's a good thing. That means although your average frame rate really is probably going to max out regardless in many cases, especially in more empty locations such as the western coast of Westfall, as I tested here, even in more hectic gameplay with 40-man raids, for example, I believe on average you're going to feel that the game is a little bit smoother than how it was in Vanilla, and that's a nice thing. I'm very happy to see what looks like a good chance that we're going to see the low end of frame rates picked up quite a bit on Classic compared to the Vanilla client. I also monitored my GPU and CPU usage during all of these tests, and at the top we can see the GPU usage. The red bar indicates the Classic client with the Classic options enabled, The pink bar in the middle indicates the classic client with maximum settings enabled, and the green bar on the right indicates the vanilla client with maximum settings enabled. Now what I thought was interesting is that the classic client with the classic settings and the vanilla client with the maximum settings are actually fairly similar. So on the left we have the GPU average percent usage, and it's all pretty low, right? So between around 14 to 16 or 17% of my GPU is used on average, with either the classic client on classic settings or the vanilla client on maximum settings. And then the maximum percent usage on the right was increased a little bit, but ultimately they were very, very close. We're talking about 17% versus about 20%, so really no difference there. However, with the classic client on maximum settings, we see a significant increase in the average and maximum GPU usage. Basically, the game moves up to pretty much using on average 40% of my GPU's maximum capacity, and this is a 1080 Ti at stock settings, so this is a very powerful graphics card relative to the average graphics card. I suspect that there will be some bottlenecks for people using older graphics cards, but anyone that's using at least, let's say, a GTX 960 or above will probably run Classic WoW quite well. On the bottom, we have the CPU usage. Now, if you look at my previous video, a couple videos back, where I was really looking at the patch 8.1 PTR Battle for Azeroth multi-threaded changes, you'll probably be familiar with this graph. What I found essentially was that the differences in terms of the number of threads or cores being used by my processor for Classic WoW on the classic settings, Classic WoW on maximum settings, and Vanilla WoW on maximum settings was not that different. The first three on the left, threads used at greater than 15%, greater than 25%, and greater than 95%. What this means is that during my testing, only 1 or 2 threads of all 32 threads on my processor were used at least 15% of their maximum capacity. There were actually none that were used at really above 50% even. So none of these games with any of these settings really were pushing any of my individual threads or cores very heavily. Across all 3 tests, my CPU reached a maximum clock speed of 4.32 gigahertz. That didn't change for any of the tests. And my total CPU usage, so across all 32 threads, there was very little difference. We're talking 2 or 3% of my total processing power was used on average, and the maximum used was only 3 or 4%. So the CPU usage changed very little across any of these tests, and that's the takeaway message from this. There's really very little input on the CPU in this specific test when you increase the graphical settings in Classic WoW from the classic option to the maximum settings. Now, of course, this demo has no player characters besides myself, no NPCs, no mobs, no game objects. This means that the CPU usage is probably going to be kind of low anyway, and it may increase more and more objects are on screen and more things are going on, and certainly the GPU usage also would probably increase as more things are occurring. But for this limited test, the takeaway message here really is that the CPU usage doesn't seem to change wildly between any of these settings, but the GPU usage does increase quite dramatically when you really max out the settings on the classic client. The summary here is that Classic WoW seems to be put together pretty well, and I think on average we're going to see the game is running fairly smooth, and I think it's going to run better than Vanilla WoW did, not only back in 2004, but also better than Vanilla WoW would run on modern hardware in 2018. If you have any questions about how the tests were conducted or would like to see me run any other tests, leave a comment below and let me know what you'd like to see. And with that, thank you guys for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.